Do you think cigarettes should be banned altogether as a health
No,
hazard?
no. I don't think it makes any sense really to ban cigarettes. And as I said earlier in my speech, I don't think that makes sense. I think there is certain legislation that should be passed if the industry itself will not take the steps to deal with the problem. And I don't think that the steps that have been taken so far have been satisfactory, and that's what we discussed at this meeting.
Did you and the representatives from the industry agree that young people should be discouraged from smoking?
Frankly, the industry has always taken the position to direct all of their efforts to adult smokers.
You do agree that young people should be discouraged from smoking?
There's no question in our mind that this is an adult habit and not a children's habit.
Move around, Jeff, around.
Senator, can you hold just a second till the man gets on his machine? There it is.
Only one live senator here.
I'd rather have you.
Is everybody ready?
All representatives of the cigarette industry visited Senator Kennedy this morning on a prearranged basis with Senator Kennedy. There were members of the Public Health Service and a member from the Commerce Committee. All representatives of the cigarette industry in this country were present. Frankly, let me say that we discussed informally, quite frankly, and quite openly all matters that were involved in the growth, manufacture of cigarettes. And Senator Kennedy heard our views, after which we had a very meaningful discussion, in my judgment.
I found the discussion with the representatives of the cigarette industry in the United States very helpful, and I am hopeful that we would make some progress in the relationship of children, particularly smoking cigarettes. I express my concern about the fact that it's estimated between 4,500 and 5,000 young people here in the United States begin to smoke cigarettes every day, that approximately 1 million children every year begin to smoke cigarettes. People who are older can make their own decision. They can read the reports and they can decide for themselves whether they want to continue cigarette smoking. But for young people, I expressed my concern, and I think that concern was shared by Senator Clemens and the other members, the other representatives of the industry who were present. It's now a question of trying to develop a program to deal with that problem, that specific problem. I am hopeful that it will be done by the industry themselves without legislation. And I'm hopeful that this meeting this morning contributed toward finding an answer or a solution.
Senator Clemens, did you and your group find any value at all in the senator's proposed legislation?
The legislation was never discussed. No, I wouldn't. I think that Senator Kennedy would say that compromises were never a matter of discussion. Principles were discussed.
May I ask that, having placed this emphasis on the smoking of young people, does that mean that you've abandoned all the other phases of your 3 bills?
No, it does not. As Senator Clemens, as the spokesman for the industry, has indicated, there was no detailed discussion of the legislation. There was a discussion about the problem. There was a discussion about what could be done about it. And we all agreed that if the industry itself could introduce self-policing efforts, that would be the most advisable step that could possibly be taken. If that was done, if those efforts, those actions were taken by the industry, perhaps some of this legislation that I've suggested would not be necessary. But we hope to continue to work on
Senator,
that matter.
You
as I
have-
said, we emphasize particularly about the effect of the cigarette smoking on young people.
You have said that cigarettes would have been banned years ago as a health hazard if it hadn't been for the economic power of their producers. Do you still feel that?
Yes, I still feel that. I don't think that we discussed that in detail in that room. Well, what we discussed in the greatest detail was the advertising on television, and advertising generally, that where the advertising has appealed to children. I had suggested that perhaps we shouldn't have any advertising of cigarettes after 9 o'clock at night, in a speech that I gave earlier. It's possible that a better way to proceed would be to stop advertising on programs which had a certain level of children watching those programs. I watched the football games, for instance, on Sunday, and the cigarettes were advertised. I know there was a large number of children who watched those professional football games. A large number of children watched sporting events. I said that I think that that's a matter of concern. Let me say that I think that the industry understands that as well as I do. They have children, and their children have friends. So I think that they understand what the problem is as much as I do.
What
Do you
would
feel that you have
the
an
industry's view, Mr. Clements, on in preventing cigarette advertising or not placing cigarette advertising accounts on programs after 9 o'clock or on sporting events?
I would not be in position to make that judgment, even though I had one of my own.
Well,
There are 9 cigarette companies in this country that advertise cigarettes. I think the cigarette companies have taken a strong position that cigarette advertising should not be on any program that has a high children listener
that
or a
includes football.
large audience. Any event, any program that has a large children's audience, and of course the only basis they've had to use was the Nielsen reports. And today, every single program that has over, according to Nielsen's reports, that has over a given number of children's audience has been barred from television. That's a question of whether you lower those figures or not, Senator. Because at this good hour, there's not a single program that Nielsen's reports that shows a high children's audience that's not already off of television.
I think that's percentage, isn't it, Senator?
Yes,
it's not.
percentage.
It's not numbers. It's percentage,
Percentage.
and whether it should be done in numbers. Governor Minor, speaking for the industry and speaking for the code, said that they would, and some other members of the industry said that they would now make a study and work with congressional committees to determine whether that should be revised.
Senator Clements, was this meeting intended as a peace conference between the tobacco industry and Senator
Oh,
Kennedy?
sir, this was an opportunity that the industry might have to have a face-to-face confrontation and a friendly discussion of Senator Kennedy's position, and also the privilege of stating their views as they were able to do and were permitted to do this morning to Senator Kennedy.
Senator Kennedy, how much time will you give the industry to improve
Not-
its self-regulation?
It was not. It wasn't put on that basis.
No,
Thanks,
sir.
Senator.
Yeah.
Nice to
Thank
see
you.
you.
What basis was it put on?
Put on.
Any at all?
Well, we hope to keep in touch with one another. But,
One more question. What was accomplished? There were a few lawyers.
as I said, I think what they are now going to study to determine whether they are a system of advertising.
Wait just a minute. I'd just like you to bring out this point about the percentages and so forth. Okay.
Today,
Go ahead.
today in our conference, we try to point out what had been achieved by the Cigarette Advertising Code. It has 2 objectives. One is to prevent appeals to youth, and secondly, to prevent health claims. I think the advertising in the last 3 years has changed considerably, and this is what I try to point out at this conference today.
Well, can more be done now?
We're certainly willing to sit down with the Senate Commerce Committee or their staff and the House Commerce Committee and their staff to talk about means by which the code could be altered or strengthened in order to achieve some of the objectives that have been set forth in some of the proposed legislation.
Would this mean further restrictions on cigarette advertising on programs watched by a large number of children?
Well, the problem always has been is what is a program designed or put on the air primarily directed to youth? And up to date, we've been using a national rating organization, and if it reaches 45% of the if 45% of the audience for 2 consecutive reporting periods of a month each reach 45%, then we say that it should be abandoned.
You mean if children make up 45%?
Yes, if children make up, if people from 0 to 20 years of age inclusive are over are 45% of that audience, then it must be abandoned.
Now, the industry will now consider lowering the 45% in order to restrict the advertising aimed at children?
The industry is willing to discuss any different standard than we presently apply.
How low do you think the industry might drop it, Governor?
I could not predict. Now, for instance, a program such as this has very low youth appeal.
You never know.
Well, no, we after all take readings on it, and they run 16, 17% as contrasted to some other programs where you might have a spy venture, or you might have some particularly youthful program, then it'll run up as high as 70%.
The senator is concerned about professional football games, believing that a large number of children watch those.
Well, the statistics don't seem to indicate it. We've checked that very carefully, and never have we had any youth audience exceeding the 45%.
Well, Governor, have you found Senator Kennedy's references to such things as professional football games a realistic approach to the problem?
I think his motivation is to prevent youngsters from smoking. And he sees this, perhaps because he has a family, and they do watch the games. He sees this as an exposure, and I think he's interested in it. Naturally, as a father, he is interested as to whether his children smoke.
Do you find his approach realistic?
Well, I think many of us predicate our views on the basis of our experience, and he's expressing his experience. To that extent, it's realistic.
From your view, is it realistic?
I frankly think that we would have to have more study as to whether a commercial on an athletic program, is really having an effect in making a youngster smoke or causing him to smoke.
You've said now that you're willing to discuss and you need more study, and taking your words with Earl Clements' words, it sounds like that you're really not going to do much.
Well, I hope we could do much, because I'm sure that if you have legislation that is ill-considered or is speedy,
what is the next step then?
Then you don't get a real result.
The Kennedy legislation, you think, would be ill-considered in its present form?
I'm not characterizing all of it, but I would like to say this generally. The kind of legislation dealing with percentage of tar and nicotine and having a different tax structure, well, it'd be awfully hard to have a uniform test as to what has the percentage of tar and nicotine. This is not easy to determine, and it's not easy to mix up a batch of tobacco and have it at a reliable percentage all the time. It's certainly not easy to set up a tax structure that would cause the difference between the milligrams of tar in one cigarette and milligrams of tar in the other. Many of those things are maybe the basic idea is good from the standpoint of someone who's determined to limit the amount of smoking, but to put them into operation requires a good deal of effort. Now, the FTC said they were going to set up a laboratory in order to test all cigarettes and get out the percentages. They were going to publish it, and I think it's well over 14 months now that it took them to get the laboratory established and to set up the standards. You know, it's easy to say, I can tell you how much tar and nicotine there is in a cigarette, but it's much more difficult to go out and get smoke testing machines and hire the people to supervise them and have uniform standards as to testing. For instance, you've got a 101 millimeter cigarette, you have a 100 millimeter cigarette, you have an 85 millimeter cigarette. Some you have a filter this long, and some it's much longer. Sometimes you have an overwrap. So how far are you going to smoke it? And how many puffs are you going to get out of it? And by the time you really get this analyzed, it's hard to get an accurate estimate of one cigarette with reference to the next cigarette. And I'm sure the Federal Trade Commission had in mind that it was simple. But when they started to get it done, they found it much more complicated. And that's what I say happens with respect to a good deal of this legislation.
Well, Governor,
The manufacturers insist, and this is their statement time and time again, that they're endeavoring to get people to change from one brand to the other brand. And there's much to back that up from what I've been able to observe.
Well, to summarize, Governor, what do you think?
All I can say is I would hope that there might be a better working relationship between the cigarette manufacturing industry and people like Senator Kennedy and the staffs of both the Commerce and the Senate Committee. And perhaps we can adopt some of these objectives so that we can do it by self-regulation rather than do it by legislation where the adversary type of proceeding might involve 4 and 5 years to get something done. If you do it by self-regulation, you do it immediately.
can I ask just one more question? What is
I understand that it's still being tested and there are still being surveys made, but this is not a province of mine in the cigarette advertising code.
well, what's the major difficulty with this filter? That it doesn't taste like a cigarette after you've pulled all the way through it?
I have had no direct exposure to information with respect to the cigarette. I've read the newspapers, but I'm not willing to quote them.
But the filter is not.
Look, thank you.
Thank you. Before you leave, you are now, what is your title?
Administrator of the Cigarette Advertising Code.
Correct to call you the cigarette czar?
They have, but
Got together and